everyone. Such a pleasure to see such a large crowd today. I was a little afraid with the snow and everything that you will not come, but you did. So thank you so much for being here today with us. Before we proceed, I would like to remind you that we are on the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. And every time when you walk through this land, please think about the communities that actually allowed us to be here today and share this space with us. This was traditional land of Ojibwe Anishinaabe people, Huron-Wendat, but also many other nations use this corridor here of the Humber Valley, known as the Caring Place Trail, to actually move between the Northern Ontario and Lake Ontario. So this presence is very particularly felt in this space with Norval Morisot, Daphne Ogic paintings. So please, you are going to focus on Maria Chapdelaine, but think about this presence because it makes this place so special. So thank you again for being here, and thank you to John Gagnon, who is our speaker today, to join us on this Sunday. And probably some of you know John quite well. I just mentioned to one of you that he contributed a wonderful essay to the River of Dreams, the Impressionism on the St. Lawrence, and he spoke about Robert Pilot a couple of times here. He spoke also with other actually exhibition that he's curated here, and he's curating, so we will hear him again on February 9 with Derek Sullivan. But today we are going to focus on Maria Chapdelaine. So John Gagnon, it's Associate Curator Collection and Research at the McMichael from 2022. And during this time, he contributed several shows, and he contributed also to the publication around those shows. So quite important person, but what I love about John is that he is very good researcher. He's a researcher, but some people even say detective, art detective. And that actually resonates very well with our school audience when we say, oh, that's curated by this art detective curator. And he always finds something new and refreshing about the collections and works that we have seen for so many years. So with Maria Chapdelaine, I know that some of you, they are not seeing this project first time. Those illustrations probably coming back every 2 or 3 years when we have them on view. We had some curatorial talks with Ian Tom, with Chris Finn, who was our associate curator of research previously, but I am sure that John will bring some new body of knowledge to that exhibition. And without further ado, I would like to invite him to the podium. So John.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to chat with you all today about Clarence Gagnon and his magnum opus, Maria Chapdelaine. Many of you will have seen it on your way in. And if you've not yet had the chance to become acquainted with these 54 magnificent small-scale drawings by Gagnon, I hope that you take some time after this talk to really dive in. They've been with us at McMichael since 1969, and they're truly one of the gems of our collection. They're one of the best known bodies of work that we have, and they continue to surprise us and intrigue us. And so I'm very excited to share with you today some of my thoughts about Gagnon and about Maria Chapdelaine. So I'm going to start this talk by really doing a deep dive into who Gagnon was and what he worked on before this project. Gagnon did not actually begin work on the Maria Chapdelaine drawings until 1928 and finished in 1933. He died less than 10 years later in 1942. And this is really the last significant and sustained body of work is in his career. And so we basically have the whole career getting up to this point, which I feel really intertwines with Maria Chapdelaine, and it's something that he's building throughout his career. So Clarence Gagnon was born in 1881. His father was a manager at the Ogilvy flour mill in Montreal. And interestingly, his mother was actually Anglophone. She had been born in the UK and traveled, immigrated to Quebec, and was a musician herself. She actually published newspaper articles about music. And in his youth, Gagnon was really supported by his mother, who understood his creative urge and impulse. This is a photo of the family home in Sainte-Rose, which is just north of Montreal, which was a community filled with artists. Henri Julien, the famous cartoonist, lived there, as did Louis-Philippe Ibert, a very famous sculptor, and his sons, who also went on to be famous artists and founders of the Beaver Hall Group. And so Gagnon was one of 8 children. Sadly, 4 of those, his siblings died in infancy, so he was one of 4 children who were raised to adulthood. But sadly, his mother passed away in 1889. And his father remarried. This woman was a francophone, and he liked to tease her by only speaking English in front of her because she couldn't speak English. But he grew up being a very creative person, but he was not necessarily supported by his father. 2 of his older brothers had went on to be engineers and architects, and his desire to study painting was not necessarily something that was fostered by his father and his stepmother. That did not stop him, however, from enrolling in the Art Association of Montreal in 1897 when he was just 16 years old. His tuition was paid for by an aunt who believed in his artistic talent. And here is a photo of him and a fellow artist when they were students at the Art Association of Montreal. And when he was there, Gagnon really benefited from the studies in life drawing and still life, benefited tremendously under the tutelage of William Brimner, one of the artists who's represented in our exhibition, River of Dreams. Brimner was a Brit by birth, but he really defined art instruction in Canada and trained an entire generation of artists. All of the members of the Beaver Hall Group, people like A.Y. Jackson, Gagnon, much of Quebec's art in this period was really molded in his hands. And he really encouraged his students to paint the landscape, to paint outdoors. And it was, in fact, Brimner who was the first person to encourage Gagnon to go and paint in Baie St. Paul, in Charlevoix, and the Ile d'Orleans, which was an area that Brimner found deeply inspirational himself. So here we see an early example of Gagnon's work in Baie St. Paul, done before he would eventually go to Paris. All students at the time were really looking for the opportunity to go to Paris to study, and that was something that Brimner very much encouraged of his students. But given that Gagnon's family did not come from tremendous means, the real jumping off point for him to allow him to go to Europe to study full-time was support of a patron. There was a man by the name of James Morgan, who was the heir to the Morgan's department store in Montreal, who had a gallery themselves and sold works. And Morgan agreed to sponsor Gagnon. He would pay him $75 a month in exchange for 12 paintings a year. So Gagnon would hand over the paintings at the end of the year. And this was a contract that happened from 1903 until about 1910. But this kind of stable, steady income allowed him to go to Europe, and anything that he painted more than 12, he could keep and sell with other galleries. But it was really a career-defining moment for Gagnon. What I'll also say, what kind of uniquely positioned Gagnon in this period was his French-Canadian heritage, but also his fluency in English. As we know, Quebec in this time, despite the fact that an overwhelming amount of the population was Francophone, the money, the power, and the influence was held by Anglophones. And so Gagnon's fluency and able to kind of talk the talk with many wealthy Anglophones, and even indeed at the art school, at the Art Association, opened doors for him that many other Francophones wouldn't be able to access. And so in 1903, or 1904, I believe in January, he left to study at the Académie Julienne in Paris, which was at the time one of the kind of premier classical art schools, and he studied under Jean-Paul Laurens, who was not an artist that he particularly appreciated his teaching techniques. I think more than learning at the Académie Julienne, Gagnon really took the opportunity of being in Paris and being in Europe to study art that he liked firsthand, rather than sit in studios and do lots of life drawing. He did that too, but I think the greatest thing that his time in Europe really offered him was the opportunity to paint. One other great thing that an encounter that he had was meeting with James Wilson Maurice, who had been introduced to him by William Brimner. Brimner and Maurice had been friends for more than a decade, and through introduction by Brimner, Gagnon met Maurice, and was the person who, in fact, encouraged Gagnon to start painting on panel sketches. So the small scale sketches, we have one at the front of the River of Dreams show and one at the end, painted on panel, were indeed at the recommendation of Maurice. Maurice also suggested painting locations like St. Malo. He himself had been deeply moved by the beaches there, and within a decade, Gagnon found himself kind of painting in Maurice's footsteps. The two kept a kind of lifelong correspondence, and Gagnon was indeed even part of some of the memorializations that happened after Maurice's death in 1924. And also in this period, kind of just before he had left, here he is in his studio that we can see. He's right in Montparnasse, one of the kind of artistic hubs of the city. If we consider kind of what's going on at this time, this is the emergence of Fauvism, the emergence of Picasso and Cubism on the scene as well. He is in Paris right as this kind of whirlwind of modern art is taking over. He didn't necessarily subscribe to many of those tenets. He was very much committed to a 19th century realistic impressionist painting style, but he was really in the thick of it in this period. Next, we see this beautiful painting. This is actually a painting that he completed before he went off to Europe. It was based on studies in the Ile d'Orléans. But it wasn't exhibited in Montreal until after he had already left for Paris. He sent a letter to William Brimner saying, like, oh, if you can show something, why don't you send this to the Art Association Spring Show. And so this was shown, and shortly thereafter there was an exhibition in St. Louis, Missouri. It was their World's Fair. At the time, World's Fairs were extremely popular. Les Expositions Universelles in 1867 kind of kicked off this craze, and then every 3 years there would be one somewhere. And indeed, Missouri is as good a place as any to hold a universal exhibition. And so in the Canadian department, they sent a group of paintings, including this one, and this actually won a bronze medal for painting. And so I imagine that Gagnon was quite chuffed, not even 25, winning an international painting, a medal for painting internationally. And soon after, the painting was acquired for the Art Association of Montreal's collection, which put a little bit of money in his pocket as well, which must have been quite exciting to the young, kind of starving artist working abroad. And then in this period, Gagnon really turns his attention to etchings. And they, for the next 5 years, take up some of his, a deep amount of his time. At McMichael, we actually have a full suite of Gagnon's etchings. He's known to have made about 30 of them. They were gifted to us back in 2020 by Heather and Brian Iyer. And some of you may have seen, we did an exhibition of them around the time of their acquisition with some other paintings by Gagnon in the collection. But what I see when I'm looking at these works is Gagnon's meticulousness. This is one of the earliest sketches or etchings that we have. And you can see the incredible amount of detail that's going into these copperplate etchings. He was technically a very skilled printmaker, and it was something that he kind of pained over. We see again here. And then these are early 1904 and 1905. And then when we see here by 1907, we can see how much stylistically he's even jumped forward. The amount of etching and cross-etching here is quite minimal, and within 2 years here, this is incredibly rich. He's studying, of course, the work of Whistler, who was a dear friend of Maurice, and he even acquired some small prints by Whistler, and he was also gifted etchings by Rembrandt, and so he was spending a lot of his time kind of looking at what other people had done, and then turning his effort to this. What I will also say about the etchings is that they stayed with him for a long time. He continued to pull prints from his own etching plates for the next 30 years. They provided a fairly stable income. They were at a price bracket that was very appetizing to Canadian art audiences as well as tourist art audiences in Europe. And so he did not edition his prints, but when he would do an exhibition, he would maybe pull 30 of certain prints and then sell them all and then continue to print them. But they did provide a really a stable income, especially throughout the First World War, when time and money to be spent on art was quite minimal. But while in Europe, he really took the opportunity to travel. This is a scene at Dinan. I'll also say that it was these kinds of scenes that were popular in Canada. In Montreal in particular, the taste for paintings was not of modern Canada. They would not have been interested to be, the art collectors of Montreal were not interested in, Maurice Cullen's painting of Quebec City. They were much more interested in Dutch paintings that are about 100 years old. And so European scenes were quite fashionable with wealthy Montreal collectors. And so his paintings like this of France and like this of Venice would have been what he was best known for in Canada for this period. And he really took the opportunity to travel and look at art, going to Spain to see works by Velázquez, traveling all across France and Italy for inspiration. And at this time, he also meets his first wife, Catherine, who was a Montrealer, like he was. She had been traveling with her family, and they met, and they got married in 1907. And she served as the model for many of his paintings. She supported him, and they traveled together significantly. Around this time, as Gagnon's reputation is increasing, he severs his relationship with Morgan, his patron. He felt that he was getting a raw deal. Morgan had also made his son in charge of the account, who didn't quite understand art in the same way. And so Gagnon severed that relationship, began working with Johnson Art Galleries, where he worked for the next 30 years. But he also realized that the exclusivity that he had with Morgan was not necessarily something that he wanted as a free agent, working with many different people, both in Europe and in Canada and the US would be better for him. And so to kind of help him make these connections, he and Catherine traveled back to Canada in 1909. And this is where he makes his next trip to Baie-Saint Paul. And he had traveled to Baie-Saint Paul about 10 years earlier, which was not possible by train. You had to go by boat and cart and other means. And at this time, when he travels there, he's able to travel by train. And he already kind of sees what's going to change about this community that he loved so much. In the 10 years that he had been there, he had seen many of the buildings be demolished, and a lot of people leaving. Some people remained, some people that he was quite close friends with, including the Simon family, Cimon. You'll see some of the textiles that were woven were by Alice Simon, the wife of Xavier Simon, who were some of his dearest and closest friends. So this is a painting painted later. I'll talk about it a little bit more in the future, but it was based on his experiences of coming back to Baie-Saint Paul in 1909. And then as long as he's in Baie-Saint Paul in 1909, he leaves just as quickly. So after about 3 months, he decides he's ready to go back to Paris. This time he takes up a new studio, and it is a studio that is subsidized for artists, and he holds on to the studio for the next 30 years. It's actually kept in his name until 10 years after he died. And so he always, despite the fact that for the rest of his career, he mostly paints Canadian scenes, many of them are painted in Europe, including all of the works from Maria Chapdelaine. I love this picture. This is the first work that you encounter in the exhibition. You can actually see that it is his wife, Catherine. You can see she's wearing the same kimono in this photo. She's here with her sister. And what's really interesting to me is that he's kind of taking these Parisian ideas, this bohemian attitude, the influence of Japanisme. He was also, as much as he was influenced by Whistler, he was also deeply influenced by Japanese printmaking techniques. And he's taken this idea, this slightly romantic, slightly sexual idea, and transplanted it into like deep rural Quebec, where there is very traditional French-Canadian Catholic ideologies. It's this kind of clash of worlds, which I think is represented in the exhibition and is perhaps most beautifully summed up in this work. At this time, he also begins conversations with Reitlinger Gallery, who was a commercial art gallery in Paris. And they said, well, why don't we do a solo exhibition of your work? So this is about 1910, and so he spends the next 3 years making paintings for this exhibition. He painted nearly 75 paintings, which account for almost half of the major canvases of his entire career, and painted in a very short period of time. The exhibition opened. We have here a very bad reproduction of a photo of that first exhibition, but it is acknowledged as the first solo exhibition of a Canadian artist abroad. The works didn't sell particularly well, but he did receive many good notices in newspapers, both in Canada and in France, which to him was just as good. He thought that his reputation was as important as the sale of paintings. But what's somewhat interesting is that of the 75 paintings that he made, or of the paintings that he showed, 54 were scenes of by St. Paul, and 15 were European scenes. So despite the fact that there was not an appetite for Canadian scenes in Europe, in England, in Canada, in France, there was a deep appetite for these works, and that was what people were really interested in seeing. They were interested in seeing what Canada was. Canada was a place that people hadn't visited before. It was not a subject that necessarily was shown very often in the Salon in Paris. Occasionally, James Wilson Maurice would show paintings there, but it was not something that people in France were knew about significantly. This is also a time before color photography, so the ability to see what Canada looked like, the snow, the mountains, it was really interesting for people. So Gagnon felt that it was a success. He was included in later exhibitions at the same gallery as well. And then the war came. So this is a painting actually in our collection. The pochade for it, the sketch for it, is actually the work that you see. It's the last work in the show, and this is the canvas. So this is one of the works that was shown in that exhibition from 1913. They're just beautiful. His sense of atmosphere in snow, the shadows in snow are only blue with Gagnon. They're never any other color. With artists, really in the 19th century, snow was always gray or quite dingy. I think it was Maurice Cullen who was among the first to really paint snow with blue shadows. That is an influence we see taken up by members of the Group of Seven, as well as Tom Thompson, who were seeing paintings by Cullen and his contemporaries in shows in Ontario, particularly people like Gagnon as well. So in this period, in about 1914, the war begins, and he travels back to Canada. Things in France are a bit hairy, and he wanted to get out of there as soon as he could. He separates with his wife, Catherine. They divorce soon after, and he travels back to By St. Paul to paint again, and starts to paint paintings like this. So this is a work that's in our exhibition, River of Dreams. This kind of beautiful atmospheric. It's quite rare to see a summer scene by Gagnon. All 54 of the paintings of By St. Paul that he showed at Reitlinger in 1913 were winter scenes. And so this one, The Wayside Cross, in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada, is a rare summer evocation for him. Shortly thereafter, he can't get the etch out of Europe from him, so he goes back to Europe in 1917. He still has his studio there, and he meets up with a young woman named Lucille Rodier. Back in 1913, he painted some mural decorations for her mother's home in Montreal, and they met, and then he found out that she was an ambulance driver in the First World War. Many Canadian women went abroad during the First World War to support the troops in any way that they could, working as ambulance drivers, working for the Red Cross. People like Prudence Heward, Mabel May, Lilias Torrance Newton, kind of contemporaries of Gagnon, all did this. And this woman, Lucille Rodier, did this as well. She's actually depicted at the top left of this drawing. And they started a courtship, a relationship that would eventually lead to their marrying. But he traveled with her and then traveled back and worked in his studio in Montreal again. There's a lot of cross-Atlantic cruises that I'm trying to keep track of, so thank you for your patience. But then he finally makes it back to Baie-Saint-Paul in 1919 and marries Lucille. In September, they're setting up a home there, and he's really noticing the changes in the community. So it's now been another 10 years since he spent a significant amount of time there, and a lot of the older buildings that were from the 18th century and early 19th century had been demolished and replaced by small houses with tin roofs. He was quite devastated by this. He had really appreciated the charm and the uniqueness of the culture in Charlevoix, the folk traditions, the handicraft traditions, furniture making, and he was seeing those go away as they were replaced by things that could be purchased from the Sears catalog or the Eaton's catalog. And so this is when his efforts to start preserving and keeping a lot of those traditions alive came about. And so he worked with Madame Simone to make the textiles that we have in the last room in the show. Gagnon actually dyed all of those wools himself using local organic vegetable dyes that he harvested. He kept a garden where he grew vegetables and flowers, harvested the materials, and then used them to make dyes, and then gave the dyed wool to local weavers so that they could indeed keep some of these traditions alive. And I think this idea around cultural heritage is really the kind of key point of Gagnon's entire career. So we see here that he is skiing. He's one of the first people to ski in Baie-Saint-Paul. Americans had been skiing in other parts of Charlevoix in tourist colonies before this, but he is kind of recognized as among the first. At this time, he also begins mixing his own paints. He feels like after the war, a lot of the paint companies started to cheap out, and the paints that he was buying would freeze when he was out, commercial paints. And so he started mixing his own paints, which is like a whole kind of chemistry that my own brain cannot really comprehend. But he would use egg oil, which you take a boiled egg and then extract oil from the yolk and then mix it. So it's not tempera, it is an actual oil paint. And he would ground his own pigments and use those and keep track of them. He was very concerned about the way in which pigments shifted over time. And so paintings that he had seen 30 years before produced with commercial paints, where reds had faded to brown or where purple had faded to blue. And so he started keeping very meticulous notes on color and went back to look at them over time to see how they changed. And so he became a little bit of an expert on this in Canada, lectured on it, and it's a really important part, I think, of this kind of mid to late career. So we see paintings like this. This is another work in the collection here at McMichael that is painted just around this time in 1920 when he's beginning to experiment with making his own paintings. He also began to attract other artists to Baie-Saint-Paul. In the early 1920s, A.Y. Jackson, Edwin Holgate, and Albert Henry Robinson came to visit. Again, there was no language barrier because Gagnon was an Anglophone as much as he was a Francophone, and so he could communicate with these artists. He had known A.Y. Jackson since they were both students at the Art Association. Jackson had come to visit him in his studio in France in 1906. And indeed, Jackson also recommended during the war that Gagnon become a war artist, to which he protested. He said that people were too sick of the war. They didn't need to see it in art as well. Jackson clearly disagreed. We have a fantastic exhibition of his war art that you would have come through on your way here. And then the kind of call of Paris, the thrill of Paris, called his name once again. And so in 1924, he and Lucille traveled back to Paris. This is a time they had not been back for several years, so it was up in the air how everything had survived. The house was in a poor state of disrepair, so they spent several months cleaning it up. But this was an incredibly exciting time. This is a jazz age Paris. There is a lot of culture and art that's proliferating. There's a lot of money coming out in this period, and Gagnon's happy to be back. He also Before he goes, he is invited to be on the jury for the Wembley exhibition at the Palace of Fine Arts in England. This was one of the major exhibitions of Canadian art. If you counted the most influential exhibitions in Canadian art history, Wembley is among the top 10. It was really the first time that the Group of Seven and other Canadian modernists were being shown in Europe in a big way, and Gagnon sat on the selection committee. So you can see him here with many others, Florence Weil, Arthur Lismer, Wiley Greer, etc. There was also a lot of fights as they were putting this exhibition together. There was a traditional camp who wanted much more 19th century style paintings exhibited, and then there was the modern camp, members of the Group of Seven and Gagnon included, who were advocating for more modern art. And so here we see the painting that he exhibited at Wembley, now in the collection of the Art Gallery of Ontario. But when he had the opportunity internationally, he was always looking to show distinctive parts of Canadian culture. And so here we see this kind of wonderful, jubilant scene of life in rural Quebec. This painting, also painted in this period, was exhibited at the next major Canadian exhibition that Gagnon was involved in. After the success of Wembley, Canadian diplomatic figures and people like Eric Brown, who was the director of the National Gallery of Canada at the time, wanted to kind of capture the lightning in a bottle that had happened in Wembley and restage a show of similar importance in Paris at the Musée Jeu de Paume and show Canadian art in this way. And as Gagnon was living in Paris at the time, the brunt of the responsibility for the organization of this actually fell on him, an artist, not a curator. And so he was responsible for finding artists and paintings to be exhibited in this show, for negotiating the dates of when the exhibition could open. The exhibition was slotted for April 1927, and then Monet died like a week before, and they were going to be scrapped and pushed for a Monet retrospective, and then that got canceled at the last minute. So tensions were quite high as he organized this, but the Musée Jeu de Paume was also a successful exhibition. It's now recognized, again, a poor slide, sorry. We have Canadian paintings on the wall. I think we have some by MacDonald and Jackson here. But this is also the first time internationally that art by settler artists was being shown alongside Indigenous art. So there was a selection of Northwest Coast masks and model totem poles that were exhibited. And this was really the first time that Indigenous art was being used as a marker of Canadian art. This is an area of deep interest to my own research. And it was Gagnon who was really ahead of the curve on this. I think part of his interest in art of the Northwest Coast came from the fact that in 1925, he was commissioned to do illustrations for a book called Le Grand Silence Blanc, The Great White Silence, which was a book written by a Frenchman about life in northwestern Canada and Alaska. Again, this was the first time that Gagnon had the opportunity to work on illustrations for a book, and given that it was set in this geography, he became very interested in Indigenous art. We can see that it's reproduced here on the cover. And Gagnon had originally wanted to do a series of wood engravings. He decided that he had had enough with etchings, was really interested, because of his interest in Japanese prints, in woodblock printing, but found that the printing press that the publishing house used was too harsh, and it would actually damage all of the printing blocks, so that wouldn't work out. So he began to have discussions with the printers about different processes that he might be able to use, and they landed on monotype printing and then photolithography. So this was quite an innovative technology at the time, where a photo would be taken and then a lithograph would be produced or several different lithography stones would be reproduced, each one representing different colors. So we see here some of the illustrations from Le Grand Silence Blanc. But these are monoprints. So they were based on monoprints. So what Gagnon would do is he would take a piece of linoleum, he would paint on it, and then make a print of it on paper. And then that would be photographed and then would be reproduced in the book. So he's painting backwards because the printmaking is involved. He's painting in layers, but what you get is this really beautiful quality to the images. They're very soft. The edges are not harsh. There's no dark contour lines. They become very atmospheric. And this book ended up being a huge success, but it took him forever, a very long time, and he vowed to never work on a book project again. But we see here the kind of the trials that he also began. He would make several studies before he would get to the final product that was in the book. And when the book was published, the government of Quebec actually wanted to purchase all of them. They said, we want to purchase all of the original illustrations for our museum collection. And Gagnon was quite disappointed to learn that in his arrangements with his publisher, they actually kept all the originals and sold them with special editions of the book. So in certain editions of the book, kind of tipped in on the first page as one of his original monoprints for this publication. But at the kind of the peak of the period in which he was trying to produce these, he was working for 12 hours a day. It was incredibly laborious and time-consuming work, which is partly why when he was asked that shortly after, he left for Switzerland for a long time and then started to travel and live abroad to kind of have a vacation from this incredibly time-consuming work that he had done. And then the same publisher who had been very successful with Le Grand Silence Blanc asked him to publish Maria Chapdelaine, and he said, no, thank you. I actually think he told the man to go to hell because he was so frustrated at the time at the amount of work that it had took. But just to kind of give you a little bit of background about Maria Chapdelaine, the book itself, it was written by a man named Louis Hémon, who was a Frenchman. He was born in France. He was actually a newspaper journalist. And in 1912, he traveled to Canada and lived in the village of Parabanca, which is on the Saguenay River, quite far north in Quebec, quite a bit further north than by St. Paul on the Saguenay River. And as a journalist, he brought a really interesting perspective to what he saw. He was interested in the social story of what was going on, was something that Gagnon was acutely aware of, and indeed one of the major themes of our exhibition, River of Dreams. But he was seeing how young people in particular were leaving these small villages in great numbers. They were finding work in factories in Montreal and Quebec City and further south in America. There were lots of textile mills that employed former Quebecers. Hémon kind of picked up on this and wrote this beautiful book called Maria Chapdelaine that was originally published serially in magazines in France beginning in 1913. Hémon actually died before the work was published. Quite tragically, he was hit by a train in northeastern Ontario, so never saw the success of this book, but it was wildly successful, not immediately. When it was published in magazines, it didn't get much attention, but over the years, interest in the book grew enormously. Today, I've kind of said in a kind of glib way that it is like Quebec's version of Anne of Green Gables. It is this incredibly deeply beloved piece of literature, even though it's not written by a Canadian. Its setting has really, it's really become a part of beloved French-Canadian literary tradition. And then it was time to illustrate it. And the first illustrated edition was actually released in 1916, and the illustrator is none other than Marc-Aurèle Dufoy de Suzer-Côté. So Suzer-Côté was a kind of contemporary of Gagnon. His works are represented in our exhibition as well. And he made a series of black charcoal drawings, essentially, that were reproduced photolithographically as well in black and white. And so I think he made about 25 illustrations. We can see some of them here. These have all been kept together. They're now in the collection of the Musée National des Beaux-Arts de Québec, all 25 of them. So they're wonderful to see. But most of them are actually, so I've shown you several of the scenes that are where he's depicting scenes, but many of the illustrations are actually more just like portraits of the individual players in the Maria Chapdelaine story, chief among them being Maria. We also have her parents, her boyfriend, her betrothed, Francois Paradis, who dies quite tragically, but he is her kind of dream husband. And then once he dies, she's left kind of going through the other options, which do not appeal to her nearly as much. One of them is a Frenchman who has gone abroad to work in the United States. It's very mysterious what he does, but he beckons Maria to come with him and travel to the United States to join a land of opportunity. And the other is a kind of simple farmer who lives a life very similar to that Maria lived. And the kind of great tension of the book is, who does she choose? Does she go off to live in the United States with this kind of man about town, or does she continue to live the very difficult rural life that she's known, that her mother lived before her? This work by Cesar Cote also inspired a series of sculptures. There's about 10 of them altogether, but they're quite wonderful. But this is kind of the time that Maria Chapdelaine is getting cemented in the Canadian imagination. And then it was illustrated again in 1922 by a Frenchman who made woodcuts specifically for the book, again, printed all in black and white. So we see these by Gerard Cochet. This is a time that luxury editions and illustrated editions were really in fashion in France. I think with the economic prosperity, the 1920s saw this happen quite often. So it was illustrated again by a Russian in 1927, and again by another Frenchman with woodcuts in 1928, and then for the first time in color by another Frenchman, Jean Droit, in 1932. And so when Gagnon was setting out to do Maria Chapdelaine, it was a work that had been, it was not new territory. This had been grappled with by several artists beforehand. And so he said, this is a quote that I have from him as he was in negotiations with a publisher after he had written to a bunch of people in Canada saying, they've asked me to do it, I'm never gonna do it. He said to them, I'll do the book as though it had been my fate to do it. I'll take my time, I'll choose the best printer, and all of the originals will remain my property. It will take 2 years. Maria Chapdelaine will be my last. It's too hard to find the printer that one wants. I prefer to devote all of my time to painting. So the funny thing that we see about his time working on Maria Chapdelaine is how much he complains about the printers, how many times he's looking at proofs. One of my jobs is to look at proofs here, and I'm constantly making color corrections to different things, so it's good to know that these things still persist for over 100 years now. But he was so meticulous. He complained when the book was published, for example, about the print quality. So here we have one of the original drawings that we have in our collection versus the print. I think in particular you can see how certain colors are quite dull. For here, there's a small bench on the left-hand side. It's blue. You can see the rails in the top left corner. It's quite muddy in reproduction. And so Gagnon felt that the printing hadn't really done justice to these works that he worked on for years. So despite the fact that he started in 1928, the book wasn't published until 1933. And indeed, by 1931, he had only finished 21 of the illustrations, but many of them were illustrated 12 of them were illustrated in a very popular art magazine at the time called L'Illustration. And it was in their Christmas edition, all of these beautiful drawings. And then he got letters from around the world from people asking to buy the drawings, including, department stores in Chicago and New York and major collectors across Europe. But he wanted to finish the project and he wanted to keep the works together. The book was published eventually in 1933 in an edition of 2,000 copies. And it was kind of great success in both Canada and Europe. It retailed for $22.50 in Canada when it was sold in 1933. which is, the kind of the height of the Great Depression. And it was the kind of the equivalent to 1 month's salary of your average Canadian at the time. So this was a luxury product, and some people even thought it was inexpensive. One of his gallerists, for example, the Watson Galleries, ordered 50 copies, and then when they all arrived in Canada, he went to Eaton's and saw that they were on sale for $22 and then bought 15 more and held on to them because within a few years he was selling them for hundreds of dollars. So this was a huge moment around Gagnon, and the Quebec government asked to buy them all. But he refused. He wanted to hold on to them. There was also some politics going on where they had not supported him earlier in his career because he was not living in Quebec, and so he felt scorned, and so he didn't want to do them any favors. But what I love about the opportunity to see Maria Chapdelaine is we get to get up really close to his working process. So we see here this wonderful portrait of Maria here kind of contemplating her life beside a bread oven outside. But while many of these works are made with colored pencil and watercolor and gouache and pastel, the basis for a lot of them is in fact monoprints again. And what I love about that is that it adds a sense of atmospheric perspective. So he would lay down a ground, which in this case might be the trees and the sky, so you get that really soft feeling of atmosphere, and then he would go over it. And so about 1/3 of the works include monotype in this way. This is another one. And it really just shows his technical innovation in this way. The works are also quite small. They're reproduced even smaller in the book, but he made them quite small, but was able to pack in an enormous amount of detail. And this is where I hope you all get a chance to kind of look closely at these works. One of the things that I will say is because of his chosen materials of watercolor and gouache and working on paper, the prints themselves are quite delicate and fragile and susceptible to damage from light and overexposure. So if you're wondering why you don't see these drawings on display more often, it's because for every 3 months that they're on display, they have to be put in the dark for several years. As they're on deposit to us, we take a deep responsibility of kind of preserving these works for all time. And so we kind of mortgage their future when we show them in the present. And so if you're sad that you don't get a chance to see them more often, this is indeed why. But as they are a kind of cornerstone of our collection, we do try to bring them out every 3 to 5 years. But again, it's just incredibly atmospheric and beautiful, moody little portraits. And this is my favorite. So Gagnon himself didn't title the works. These titles were applied soon after they came to McMichael in his own time. They were mostly numbered based on their appearance. This exhibition actually preserves how their appearance in the book. So if you are reading Maria Chapdelaine and looking at these drawings, they would come in sequential order. They've been exhibited in many ways in the past, grouping all of the interior scenes together, all of the exterior scenes together, but we thought it would be a nice opportunity to kind of follow the story along. And a curator applied the titles that we see here in Gagnon's time. If there was a title, it was really just a line from the book. So here, where the image appeared in relation to the text. So here in the northwest wind blew days on end, steady and strong. And so in Gagnon's time, when these works were exhibited, those were, in quotes, those were exhibited alongside them. But Gagnon was incredibly meticulous, and for each of the 54 drawings that we have, he made several studies. And these abound in museum and private collections across the country. Some he made up to 10 studies for, kind of tweaking certain elements. And what I find really interesting, if we look at these, several of them are shown in mirror image. Because he was working first in monoprint, he would sketch out things in reverse and then make them. And so there's also, again, he was somebody who was kind of deeply interested in science as he was mixing his own pigments, also interested in how these images are created in the reverse. But I have a whole fond of these images that I wanted to show you. I'm particularly interested in works like this where certain elements are reversed, but not all of them. So while most of the composition was reversed, the girl in the rocking chair is actually maintained. He decided that compositionally, that arrangement worked better when the rest of the image was reversed. But he was also doing tremendous amount of research. If you look on the right-hand side, this is Maria Chapdelaine. Her top is see-through. He was also like studying the kind of undergarments people wore, if any, and trying to really capture that in the finished works themselves. But we see a tremendous amount. Here again, this is the same image. You can see how vibrant that blue was when he was making the studies of this. So you could see how disappointed he would have been with how it was reproduced in the final work. Again, here we see most of the composition is flipped, but the posing of Maria is the same. And so these works really became a sensation for Gagnon, and he recognized it. It's also the first time in more than 20 years that he's playing with interiors. He painted a few interiors when he first arrived in Europe in about 1905, and then completely abandoned them for the outdoors. But about 1/3 of the images are indoors, and they're incredibly evocative. Gagnon was also an amateur photographer and took lots of photos of his time in By St. Paul, and so a lot of these works are actually based on photos that he had in his archives, in his scrapbooks, where he wasn't necessarily recreating the compositions, but was mining them for details, be it a bundle of dried tobacco on the wall or a certain gesture of how someone might light their cigarette. He was kind of looking at those details in photographs and then applying them to these finished compositions. So the sketches, none of which are on display, we only have the 54 originals. This is a project for a future, potentially me or someone else, is to kind of gather up a critical mass of these. But some of them are quite sketchy, like you can see this one here on the right, and some of them are highly finished, almost as if they were final works in and of themselves, and indeed not studies. This is her dream man, Mr. Paradis, as he is being exposed to what will kill him. He dies shortly after this, after his time in this blizzard. But I kind of just love the pained experience that he has. He's completely devoted himself to making these works for almost 5 years, and makes no other paintings during this period. And here we see the two works on the right actually don't end up in any real composition, but he's still trying things out. Indeed, there may be even more works on paper by Gagnon that were related to Maria Chapdelaine that we don't know about because they don't correspond to final works in the suite of 54. And indeed, Maria Chapdelaine continues to be a source of inspiration. It has been made into 4 films. The first in the mid-1930s by French filmmaker Julien de Vivier, and they actually went to the Saguenay to film it in Canada in 1934, which is like kind of crazy to think about these avant-garde French filmmakers traveling to very rural Canada to make this film. And several of the films that have been made over the years, another one in the 50s, another one in the 80s, and one quite recently, kind of mine Gagnon's compositions for some shots in the film. So if you're a fan of film, I would recommend checking some of those out as well. But they've also inspired artists. And so, of course, Jean-Paul Lemieux, a favorite, made his own very unique perspective on Maria Chapdelaine. We see here as well. And so Maria Chapdelaine kind of becomes this high point for Gagnon. He lives for another 10 years after the work's published, but he never is quite as sustained in any of his practice or projects as he is when he's working on Maria Chapdelaine. He actually spends a lot of time traveling. His wife buys a car when they're living in Europe. Oh, and so everything in Maria Chapdelaine is also made while he's in Europe, all based on previous studies of the towns in Charlevoix, but it's all based on his time, memories of his time, and indeed, sometimes the mountains look like the Swiss Alps because he was spending a lot more time in Switzerland in this period than he was in the Laurentian Mountains. And so this is something that you'll notice in both our River of Dreams exhibition and the Maria Chapdelaine drawings, is that if the mountains do indeed look a lot rockier than Charlevoix, it's because that's exactly what he was thinking about. He was spending time traveling in Switzerland, but also in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries where he felt a real kinship to Canada, but enjoyed fishing and driving much more than painting in this time. He also developed rheumatism, which made painting a little bit more difficult. He came back to Canada in 1936, sensing what was happening in Europe just before the Second World War, and he never returned, unfortunately. And so when he left in 1936, all he took with him were the 54 drawings from Maria Chapdelaine. He left behind a studio full of paintings and sketches and drawings. Thankfully, after his death in 1942, his wife returned to Europe. The studio was intact. It had not been demolished, like it had not been bombed out, and it had not been raided. And so she was able to go through and catalog many of the works that were there, apply certificates of authenticity, and that's how many of these studies remain, because they had been in Europe during this very trying time. And one of the greatest things about Lucille Gagnon is the way that she protected her husband's legacy. It was his wish that these 54 works stay together, and she honored that. And so shortly after his death, the works were offered for sale at a price of $17,000 in 1945, which was a huge sum of money, and one that far outpaced the buying habits of many Canadian museums. And so it was the industrialist Robert McLaughlin, based out of Oshawa, who put his hat in the ring to acquire these works on the condition that they be donated to a Canadian museum at some point in their future. And indeed, in 1969, Robert McLaughlin, Colonel McLaughlin, bequeathed them to the McMichael, where they've been ever since, and they've become one of our most beloved and important works. The book, Maria Chapdelaine, illustrated by Clarence Gagnon, continues to circulate on the secondary market for a fairly high price tag. For those of you with maybe a smaller appetite, we published a book about these works with an essay by Ian Thom, former curator at McMichael in the 1980s, and more recently retired from the Vancouver Art Gallery, where he worked for many years. It's a wonderful book. It's currently out of stock in our gift shop, but if you inquire, they may be able to, they have told me they're doing another printing, and they may be able to put your name down when that arrives later this spring. So thank you all for joining me today. I hope this was interesting, and I hope that you liked learning about Maria Chapdelaine and enjoy your time visiting these works.